Hi friends, welcome to a new episode of Beauty History. I am your host, Allison Chase. Beauty History is where we take a deep dive into the life, legacy, and history of a fashion or beauty icon. But before we go any further, let's take a second to grab our iced coffee or a hot coffee. Let's take a sip and let's get started. For today's episode, we will be talking about the British bad boy of fashion, the incorrigible child of the fashion industry, Alexander McQueen. Now, I've never done a disclaimer or content warning before on my channel, but I think for today's subject matter, I should give you a content warning that we will be talking about themes of suicide, depression, and attempts at someone's life. So I just wanted to give you that warning before we dive into the whole video. Alexander McQueen was born March 17th, 1969. I think that makes him a Pisces. He was born in Lewisham, England, and his name is Alexander McQueen. The Alexander McQueen name was used later for his fashion brand, but his friends called him Lee. So he was the youngest of 6 children. His mother was English and she was a teacher. His father was Scottish and he was a taxi driver in London. So from a young age, Lee had a pretty big interest in fashion, in clothing, in tailoring and design. It was just something that he really liked. And there were some family members who also worked in like the clothing world. So it wasn't completely out of his realm or depth to be into fashion and clothing. And also from a young age, Lee had a fascination with birds. He loved birds. He was an animal lover, but birds especially. And he joined the Young Ornithologists Association or group at a very young age. And this group helps with animal wildlife conservation and preservation of different types of birds in the UK. Later in life, Lee would use birds and feather motif and inspiration in a lot of his works. So at the age of 16, he left school and he attended a college called the Newham College of Further Education, and here he took a tailoring course. After this, he did apprenticeships on Savile Row. Now, Savile Row is in London. This is the golden mile of suits. People fly from all over the world to go to Savile Row to buy the best tailor-made, the best fitting men's suits. Maybe they do women's now, I'm not certain, but just suits in general. This is where you go for the best in the world. Clients of Savile Row include people like Winston Churchill, Lord Nelson, Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales. Like, this is where the cream of the crop go to get the best fitting suits. So Lee was able to apprentice here, to work here, and this is where he became one of the best tailors. Lee was known throughout his whole career as being an amazing, impeccable tailor. He could take anything and deconstruct it and then rebuild it into the best fitting anything. Even clothing that weren't necessarily suits, they were just made to fit perfectly because of the training and work that he did on Savile Row. Around this time, he came out as gay to his family. He said that he knew he was gay from the age of 6, but he only came out to his family around 18. And he was really big into the party scene, party nightlife of London, specifically in Soho, London. This area is known and has been known as very LGBTQ plus friendly. Like, if you are part of that LGBTQ plus family and you want to go out, you just want to have fun, Soho is the place to go, especially in the 90s. I think 2021 people are more open, but I forgot to mention that he was born in 1969. I think I forgot to say that. So in the 90s, late 80s, it still wasn't, it wasn't the same as it is now to be openly gay, to be holding hands with someone from the same gender as you. So people would go to Soho, and Soho is still, a very vibrant nightlife scene. And so here, Lee and his friends were part of the gay nightclub scene as well as the drug scene as well. Lee spent a lot of time with drag queens, with sex workers, and he and his friends were heavily inspired by acid house drag. This is sort of a spoof off the club kid scene, the club kid aesthetic. And so they would sort of make their own outfits to go out. You know, Lee was a great tailor, and so they would just come out with their own outfits and sort of make something with the materials and fabric they had on hand. They were students, they were young. That is not a time in life where you have a lot of money, but you know, they made do and they had a lot of fun. So as I mentioned, some of the clients of Savile Row, where Lee was apprenticing and working, one of them was Prince Charles. Now, later in life, Lee claimed that he was working on a jacket for Prince Charles, and on the inside lining, like you know how a jacket has different lining on the inside, Lee claimed that he drew penises and other obscene cartoons inside the jacket that Prince Charles wouldn't see. It's me from the future with a correction. Lee did not claim to draw a penis on the inside jacket lining of Prince Charles's jacket. He claims that he wrote this instead. Apparently, the company that he worked for got the jacket back from Prince Charles once he wore it for his event, and they claim that they saw no such penises on the jacket. Now, if they did, would they admit it? I don't know. So this is just like a glimpse of Lee being the bad boy, but like, so the nickname that he got was L'Enfant Terrible, which is French, and the literal translation means terrible child, but the expression means like the incorrigible child, the child that just won't learn, that just does whatever they want and they don't care. That was Lee. And I think this claim that he drew obscene cartoons on the inside lining of Prince Charles's jacket, that is Lee to a T. So after Lee's stint on Savile Row, he applied for a job at the Central St. Martin's Art School, which is a very prestigious art school in London. Now, he applied for a job there, but he was the same age as the students he would be teaching, and so the headmistress didn't think that was appropriate. The headmistress was Bobby Hilson. I think she still is. And she asked Lee to see his portfolio, his sketches, just to see what he was capable of. This art school offered undergraduate and also postgraduate programs. And Bobby Hilson was so impressed with his work that she talked to the admissions office and he was admitted into the master's program right away. Bobby Hilson has worked for Vogue UK, and she was also present at Coco Chanel's 1954 relaunch fashion show, and another one of her students at the Central St. Martin's Art School was John Galliano. So she's a very important person in the fashion art world. Now, in 1992, Lee graduated, and in order to graduate, he had to submit a thesis, like a master's thesis, but this wasn't like a written master's thesis, it was a fashion show. That was his body of work, his showing off his talents, everything he'd learned, and so every student had to present a fashion show, and so his was titled Jack the Ripper Stalks His Victims. This was in reference to the serial killer Jack the Ripper, who terrorized London in 1888, and he basically targeted sex workers who lived in the poor East End of London neighborhood. And this psycho wouldn't just kill women, he would like mutilate them and brutalize them in really gross ways. And so that was Lee's inspiration for his fashion show. Now, this was a lot. So the models came on the runway and they had makeup to look bruised and makeup that made them look bloody, and a lot of the fashion looked tailored to the 1880s aesthetic, but they would have red ribbons that would look like a slash of blood. Some of them would have exposed skin. There was one jacket in particular that was like the masterpiece of the whole collection. It was this jacket that was tailored to like the 1888 aesthetic, but it looked like barbed wire. And it also looked like it was stained with blood, but it was made to look like that. It was very impressive. I mean, you can see here from the get-go that Lee's inspiration and catwalks and runways sometimes lean a little bit grotesque, very theatrical, dramatic. There's nothing subtle about Lee. He's very in your face. He almost seems like a theater kid at heart because his runway shows are really just moving theater. Something that Lee did is he cut off bits of his hair and he had it like laminated and then sewn into the clothing. So instead of having a tag that says like Lee Alexander McQueen, it was just a piece of his hair. That to me grossed me out so much more than anything else. I don't know why. I don't know why. Apparently, in the 1880s, sex workers would cut off locks of their hair and give it to their Johns. And so that was perhaps Lee's inspiration. I don't know. That part grosses me out for some reason. I don't know why. At these Masters fashion shows, it was very common that people in the fashion world would come to see who's new, what's the new talent, what are we going to see on the horizon. And this was no different for Lee's Masters thesis. So in attendance at his show was Isabella Blow. Now, she was a fashion editor, a fashion tastemaker. She was known for discovering talent. Isabella Blow had an eye for talent that has not been replicated. You know the scene in The Devil Wears Prada where Miranda Priestly scolds Andy because Andy is looking at like two what she thinks are identical pieces of clothing and she's like, this is just stuff. And then Miranda has to explain to her that the Zara sweater that we get on the Black Friday sale was actually picked for us 2 years ago by editors and tastemakers. So Isabella Blow is the person that those editors and tastemakers looked to. Like she saw beauty in things that people didn't realize was there until 5 years later. Like she was always ahead of the trends and she knew good taste and good fashion before everyone else did. She discovered models, she discovered designers. Some of her more famous finds are Philip Treacy and Lee Alexander McQueen. Isabella Blow, or Izzy for short, she fell in love with Alexander McQueen's aesthetic and style, and she actually purchased his entire master's collection, which was a lot for him because he was a graduate student and grad students are not known for having a lot of money, so this was a huge help for him. And Izzy herself was a very interesting character. So she came from very, very old money. She came from very old aristocracy. Like her great-great-grandparents were extremely rich and very not noble, well, like lower nobles and aristocrats. Like she came from very high society and she was extremely well connected, not only from her wealthy family past, like she had all the connections in high society, but also Izzy had worked with the US Vogue, she had worked with Anna Wintour, she had worked with Andre Leon Talley. In her youth, Izzy had partied with Andy Warhol. She literally knew everyone, so this was a great connection to have. While Izzy was extremely well connected, she also had a very tragic backstory. So her grandfather was a baronet, and he murdered his second wife's lover, Lord Errol, while they were in Kenya. He was acquitted for the murder of his second wife's lover, but he essentially was blacklisted and shunned from high society in London, and he ended up taking his own life a few years afterwards. So that left the family quite disheveled because it just kind of ruined their name. Like they were still, so that sort of like ruined the family. Like they still had money and they were still like upper class, but they were like sort of outcast from high society. Like they were still in high society, but they just couldn't really be part of it. It's kind of interesting. And then Izzy, when she was 14, her parents divorced or separated at the age of 14. And when her mother left the family home, she said goodbye to her daughters by shaking their hand. Rough. Izzy had 2 sisters and a brother, but her brother drowned at the age of 2 in the family pool. And then, what else? Oh, so Izzy was left to live with her father because her mother abandoned her. But her and her father did not get along. And Izzy was disinherited from her father's will. And so his estate was worth over £1 million. And he left Izzy with like £5,000, which is like a lot less than $1 million. So Izzy's life was quite colorful by the time that she had met Lee. She was several years older than him. She was born in 1958, I believe, 59. So she was a few years older than him. And she was always positioned in high society, but her financial situation, depending on the year, really was precarious. But regardless of that, she still was extremely well connected. And so she acted as a mentor of sorts for Lee, and she helped him essentially start his career. Lee started the Alexander McQueen brand when he was living in Izzy's basement in Belgravia, London, which is still a very posh neighborhood. So I'm not exactly certain where all of her money came from time to time, but it was touch and go. And Izzy is the one who suggested he use his middle name Alexander for the brand. So Alexander McQueen instead of Lee McQueen. She said it just had like a nicer ring to it. Also, at this point, he was still struggling. Like he was starting out, but he didn't have that much money. And he was still getting dole benefits. So like social assistance money. And so if he used a different name, maybe the dole office wouldn't recognize him at first. His first collection after the graduation was called Taxi Driver, inspired by the Martin Scorsese film. This collection was shown at a Ritz hotel, but there were no photos taken of the collection itself, and someone stole his entire collection afterwards, so there's no proof. I mean, it did happen, but we have no tangible videos or photos of the Taxi Driver collection. At the time, things were still a bit tenuous for Lee himself, and so at his fashion shows, his mother would be there making sandwiches for everyone. Like as people were running back and forth behind the scenes, lighting, the models, etc., his mom would be there to make the sandwiches for people instead of having actual catering, which I think is very adorable. And something to note, at the Taxi Driver fashion show, this is where Lee, for better or for worse, introduced the Bumsters. These are the super low-rise jeans that essentially show the model's butt hanging out. It shows butt cleavage. And if you are a child of the 90s or 2000s, you will remember the low-rise jeans. Alexander McQueen helped make this very popular. I, for one, will go pantless before I ever wear low-rise jeans again, but we have Alexander to blame for these low-rise jeans. I think that Lee never took himself too seriously, and he always had a lot of fun with his shows, and he just enjoyed clothing. He would make clothing that maybe you and I would not wear walking down the street, but I think that was the point. For him, clothing was about art and having fun and just showing a bit of who you are.
You enjoy stirring things up, don't you?
Oh yeah, I don't like the norm. I really don't like the norm. I don't think it's, you don't move forward. Seriously, you just don't move forward if you play safe.
I certainly applaud your bravery or your courage to say what's on your mind, because I think that's one thing that I...
Doesn't always get me that way.
Well, that's it. But, I mean, you really do piss a lot of people off. And I'm really surprised that you've gotten this far with this attitude. You know, you think in this business you've got to coddle people.
You got to wait for the mafiosos to like throw a bomb through the window any minute. Kaboom.
But really, you're good at it. I mean, you're a master of that, stirring it up and winding people up.
But, you know, at the end of the day, the fundamental thing is fashion is not to be taken too seriously. And that's what I try to get across. It's not going to cure you of cancer or AIDS. It's just clothes. So don't sit there and tell me the aesthetics of a jumper because it's just there to be worn. So that's why I take the piss out of it, because they're just clothes at the end of the day, no matter what they look like. Everything's been done before, it's just the way you do it. To me, it's kind of sad that people put so much importance on clothes when actually all you do is wear them. And like I said, it's not going to cure you of AIDS or cancer, so let's not try to put that much importance on it. You either like them or you don't. If you don't like them, don't buy them. People forget what fashion's always been about, and it's about attracting a mate, it's about sexuality, it's about showing a person who you are. And to me, this is who I'm about, and my influence comes through from everything I see, from a tramp on the street, from drugs in clubs, and do you know what I mean? It's just a part of my lifestyle. I'm 27, I'm not 57.
Do you think people in general take fashion too literally, though? Like women who, you know, leaf through magazines or who turn on the tube and see stuff like this coming down the runway and then just go, oh, well, how can I wear that? Or they don't understand that it's meant to inspire.
The thing is, I'm not that type of designer to say, oh, God, you know, I've got to have one of them. I'm not asking you to have one of them. It's not for you anyway. If you have to look at it like that, then turn the page.
I think that in the fashion world, there are a lot of people who take themselves very seriously. And he didn't take himself that seriously, and he was having a lot of fun with them. And he got the nickname L'Enfant Terrible, the terrible child, the bad boy, the hooligan of the British fashion world. He got that nickname immediately. His spring-summer 1994 show was called Nihilism. And of course, it showed models with makeup that made them look bruised and bloodied. They had like see-through shirts that would expose their breasts, and they were wearing bumsters. So you had these like beautiful, elegant models, and they would turn around and they had butt cleavage. You know, he was having fun. What's interesting is from the beginning, Lee had a very adversarial relationship with fashion critics. He was described by journalist Marianne Hume of The Independent as the theater of cruelty and a horror show. She was referring to his fashion shows. So not a huge fan. But he would get these like scathing reviews saying it's like a theater of cruelty because the models have fake blood on them and it looks grotesque and blah, blah, blah. But the same critics would be running to his next shows. So interesting. I don't know. I guess scandal and that can sell, but it was just interesting because he had a very adversarial relationship with critics, and at the beginning of his career he refused to be interviewed facing the camera. So if any journalist or critic wanted to speak to him, he would have their back to them. The critics kept hating on his collections, but time after time they would run to see what new creation he had coming out. He had a collection called Birds, after Alfred Hitchcock's horror movie Birds. And this was held at King's Cross Station, and the theme was roadkill. Now, Lee's fourth fashion show was his most controversial. He had a name in the fashion world, but this fashion show helped propel him to people who weren't really in the fashion world. So his fourth show was titled The Highland Rape. Okay, so we have to talk about the Highland clearances. I am not Scottish. I've been to Scotland, it's beautiful. But I know I have viewers who live in Scotland. I have viewers who are Scottish but who live in different places. So if I get any of the information wrong about the Highland clearances, please feel free to fill in the gaps in the comment section. Let's remember that Lee's father is Scottish. So the Highlands refers to a geographical location in Scotland that is currently very sparsely populated. So in the 1800s, about 30% of the Scottish population lived in this part. By the 20th century, only about 8% lived here. So what happened? In the early 18th century, there were a lot of uprisings against the British rule in Scotland. These were called the Jacobite rebellions. Numerous Scottish clans, many of which lived in the Highlands, maintained their loyalty to the House of Stuart. The House of Stuart had ruled over England, Scotland, and Ireland up until 1688. Many in Scotland refused to acknowledge the new rule of the House of Orange and any of its successors. They simply saw these people as illegitimate rulers. But in 1707, Scotland merged with England, as did their crowns. This is when Scottish clans took things into their own hands and led a series of rebellions. The Scottish rebellion against the English crown was almost always defeated by the English, but it was very routine and very annoying for the English crown. And so they decided to come up with a solution to fix this. The English government decided that the best way to get rid of this problem was to get rid of the clan system altogether. The first thing they did was they punished the Scottish landlords who had been part of the rebellions by removing their lands and giving it to more loyal subjects. Now, what's important to remember is that some of these more loyal subjects were Scottish themselves. But a lot of these people lived in London. They didn't live in the Highlands anymore. And so they didn't have the same connection with the land as the people who lived there did. Something else happened around this time, the Industrial Revolution. And so a lot of people left the small towns and moved into bigger cities, especially London. And so when this happened, industrial food sort of started to become a thing. And with a lot of people moving into cities, they needed to find ways to feed people. So farmland was something that people wanted to make more efficient and more profitable. Landlords of the Scottish Highlands wanted to turn the Highlands into lucrative sheep farming. The only problem was people already lived there and their land belonged to them in common. So the people who lived there and the clan system had existed since before the Romans arrived. It was very, very ancient. So in order to get around this, they simply changed the laws and they made it illegal for those people who had lived there to be there. And so soldiers showed up and pulled people from their homes, and to discourage them from coming back, they burned down their homes. So over the course of a century, over 100,000 people were displaced. It's a misconception that only English people participated in the clearances. There were in fact Scottish people who participated in the clearances. However, the worst perpetrator was English, and his name was the Duke of Sutherland. It's important to note that the Highland clearances were not just about geography. It was a deliberate attempt by the English crown to disrupt and destroy Scottish clan culture, and the clan language, like the Scottish Gaelic, was actually illegal to use. Scottish Gaelic was banned by the English crown and was further suppressed after the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745. So what happened to these over 100,000 people? Well, they could starve, or they could go to the New World as indentured servants. A lot of them went to New Zealand, Australia, the United States, as well as Canada. And fun fact, Canada has a province called Nova Scotia, which is Latin for New Scotland. In the end, the Highlands ended up being very sparsely populated because the farmers in the Highlands, the sheep farmers or sheep herders, could not keep up with the sheep and wool industries in New Zealand. Ironically, the sheep and wool farmers in New Zealand were the ancestors of the Scottish Highland people. That is my best description of the Highland clearances. With that in mind, the fourth runway show from Lee was the Highland Rape. Again, we had the models with the makeup making them look bruised and bloodied. A lot of them had clothing that was torn, exposing a breast, and the critics, of course, hated it. He was accused of misogyny. He was accused again of just being grotesque, and it's interesting, people were concerned about the models because the models would come out looking disheveled and upset, but I think they forgot that models can like act and pretend to be a certain way. I think some of the critics thought that like Lee had like maybe abused the models himself, or like, I don't really know what happened. I understand that it probably was a little bit upsetting to see, and with the context of the name of the show, but he was accused of misogyny and just hating women in general. One of the critics was from the Daily Mail. Now we have to take that with a grain of salt because it is the Daily Mail, but they said that Lee was a designer who hates women. I don't know about that. He had more claims of misogyny for his spring-summer 97 collection called La Poupée, which means the doll. And he had models walk down the runway with these like metal restraints. He said that he wanted them to look like marionette dolls, like walking down the catwalk. Some of the criticisms were because one of the models was Deborah Shaw and she is black. And so there were people making connections with the metal restraints to slavery. So yeah, he was very controversial. For his 1996 fall-winter collection, it was called Dante, referring to Dante's Inferno. And that one was a huge success. He actually showed that catwalk twice, once in London and once in New York, and both were at capacity. People were lining up the streets outside wanting to see what he was going to do next. With Lee's increased popularity, he started to work and collaborate with different musicians. In the 90s, David Bowie went on tour, I think in 97, and Lee designed Bowie's entire wardrobe for the tour. That same year, 1997, Björk came out with an album, and Lee designed her wardrobe for the album art cover. And he would go on to direct a music video for her song Alarm Call. Now, in 1996, Lee was appointed the creative director for Givenchy. We've done a video on Hubert de Givenchy. I recommend you go watch that. Previously, John Galliano was working at Givenchy, but he got a job at Dior, so Lee was offered the position. Now, in the 90s, it became very popular for older, more classic houses to hire new, fresh, up-and-coming designers. I cannot think of two brands, McQueen and Givenchy, who have the most opposite aesthetic possible. Givenchy is conservative, it's classic. Think Audrey Hepburn. Audrey Hepburn was Hubert de Givenchy's muse. Does Audrey Hepburn look like McQueen? No, of course not. These are completely different aesthetics. Completely different styles, just complete different attitude towards fashion, towards beauty, towards art. This was a disaster. Before Lee had his actual position and title, he went to Paris to negotiate, and Izzy went with him, Isabella Blow. And, you know, Izzy was great at finding talent. She had discovered so many people, but she often felt neglected. You know, she would discover all of these people, and all she would get in return was like a dress. And so when Lee got his appointment at Givenchy, Izzy thought that he would take her with him. She thought that she would get a job with Givenchy, but she didn't. And so their friendship was a bit rocky at times, and this was the first time that they had a falling out and had like a bit of a rough patch. So Lee moved to Paris, and he arrived with his creative team, you know, assistants, people helping him with his line. It was like if British punk rockers landed in Paris. It was so catastrophic. Like, I think there was a mutual disdain for both. Lee was interviewed and asked what he thought about Hubert de Givenchy. At the time, Hubert was still alive, and he said that he thought that Hubert was irrelevant. Hubert had sold his brand to the LVMH group, and so he was still involved, sort of, but he was also retired. Anyway, there was a lot of animosity, a lot of disdain, and a lot of just bad vibes in both directions, because Lee and his crew were English, they were younger. There was a lot of, like, I want to say disrespect happening on both sides, because I just find it such a weird, catastrophic choice. I don't know. It's like they wanted someone who would flip the brand upside down, but it's also, I just find the pairing very bizarre.
I started in fashion because I loved it. And to me, I've got more cynical about it over time working with these people, like working in Paris, and people saying, do you know, sometimes it's not even worth talking about, because I do it because I love it, and like I do the shows because I love the energy, and the people that work with me do it because of the energy of the club scene, the drug scene, the sex scene.
Lee's debut show for Givenchy was the Spring-Summer 1997 collection, and it was widely considered to be a complete failure by fashion critics. I think critics expected that. I think they went into it expecting the worst. I think all of the titles of L'Enfant Terrible, The Hooligan, etc., they went into the show wanting to see camp, and they saw camp. A lot of the critics said it was campy, Las Vegas, showgirls. The show was Greek inspired, and I think that this whole period was a very rough learning curve for Lee. So Lee was in Paris for Givenchy, but he was commuting between Paris and London because he still had his brand, Alexander McQueen, in London. And so he was commuting back and forth and doing shows for both. He didn't give up Alexander McQueen. He was doing both at the same time. This is where a lot of the stress started to get to Lee, because fashion designers are only as good as their last collections. And so there's always pressure to do more and more and more and be better and better and just top off whatever you did last. So the first Givenchy show was not great, or at least it was not well accepted or well received by the critics. But as time went on, Lee started to refine his craft. He was always very, very theatrical, very elaborate and over the top. But I think the mixture of his background in tailoring and then working for a French house like Givenchy helped hone his craft, and his collections started being more and more beautiful. They were still very over the top and theatrical, but there was always an element of beauty there too. Lee was brought to Givenchy to just sort of reinvigorate the brand and attract a newer, fresher audience, which it did. But this was taking a toll on Lee because, as I mentioned, he was commuting back and forth between Paris and London, and it was just very stressful. He was doing 10 shows a year, and it's not just one show. You have to plan, you have to design, you have to sketch, you have to direct. It's a lot of work. Around this time, his friend Izzy got a job as a fashion director for the Sunday Times, and the two reconciled and posed together for the Vanity Fair cover. Lee continued his unusual and very theatrical fashion shows. For the 98 fall show, Lee had the Joan fashion show, as in Joan of Arc, who was famously burnt alive at the stake. So for the end of the show, a model stood at the center and had a literal ring of fire around her. Lee and other models also wore red contact lenses just to add to the unusual dramatic feel of the fashion show. Now, for the 1999 Spring-Summer collection for McQueen, I believe we saw the most dramatic ending to any fashion show ever. So model Shalom Harlow was at the center of the catwalk, and she was on a disc that was pivoting and turning around, and she was wearing a white dress, but on the sides next to her were two robotic arms that came from like a car manufacturing plant. And as she spun around in the circle in the white dress, these two mechanical arms sprayed her with paint. And it was so dramatic and theatrical and over the top. And where did he come up with these ideas? Like, where did Lee envision this? Where did he create this? I don't know. It was just so over the top and just so mesmerizing too, because you got to see fashion live as it was happening. And it's still considered to this day one of the most memorable endings to any fashion show. By the year 2000, Lee had produced close to 30 collections in 3 years. Now, his next collection for Spring-Summer 2001 was titled Voss, which is named after a Norwegian town which is known for its wildlife. Now, in the show, Lee used materials that were a bit unusual. He used wildlife, like different seashells He used razor clams, he used ostrich feathers, of course, and he just used different materials that are not known for being part of fashion. What's remarkable about Voss as a fashion show is that all of the critics and the journalists and the writers were invited to the show, and they all sat staring at this big glass rectangle. So the show was going to be inside the glass. But until the show started, because of how the lights were set up against this glass, as the critics and the writers just sat there waiting for the show to start, all they could do was stare at their own reflection, because without the lights a certain way, the glass acted as a mirror. And so the critics had to sit there and stare at themselves. And Lee made them wait 2 hours. And so they just sat there and stared at themselves for 2 hours. When the show started, the lights were fixed, and then the models would walk inside the glass case here, and they had a lot of birds and feathers, and again, looking a little bit upset, like the models looked confused, like they weren't actually confused, they were just playing it up, and they were walking around, but with the way that the lights were set up, the models couldn't see through the glass, and so it added an element of voyeurism, like the models were just minding their own business, and all the critics were staring at them without the models even knowing. So there was the big glass box, but inside the glass box was a smaller glass box, and when the show ended, the glass box, the walls fell and shattered, and all the glass sort of sprayed everywhere. And in the center of the glass, the smaller glass box, was a naked model with a gas mask on, so you couldn't see her face. And when the glass walls fell, all these moths also flew into the air at the same time. And Lee was later quoted about this entire show. He said, I was really pleased about that. I was looking at it on the monitor, everyone trying to not look at themselves. It was a great thing to do in the fashion industry. Turn it back on them. God, I've had some freaky shows. Yes, you have, Lee. Yes, you have. So at this time, Lee was still under contract with Givenchy. It was very stressed, or strained, I think is the right word. But at the end of his contract, Lee was getting different offers, and he got a great offer from the Gucci group. So at the time, Tom Ford was the creative director for Gucci. They approached Lee and they offered to purchase 51% of the Alexander McQueen company, but they would leave Lee as the creative director. So this would give Lee a buttload or boatload of money, just like Gucci group. They have a lot of money. So this is what Lee did. He signed with Gucci. He signed away 51% of his company, but he remained as creative director. What's interesting is at the time, Gucci was Givenchy's #1 rival. So it was like a final farewell, screw you to Givenchy. With all of this money, Tom Ford said to Lee, listen, you can create the most fantastical theatrical shows, you can do the most dramatic shows you want, but you also have to create things that people will buy at a boutique or at a department store. So with this money, Lee was able to expand to a men's line, a shoe collection, handbags, scarves, and the telltale sign of a McQueen piece is a skull. His scarves, his handbags all have a little skull on them. That's McQueen. On average, Lee's shows would last about a half hour and would cost about $250,000 to make. When Lee left Givenchy, he was replaced by Julian McDonald, who was also one of Izzy's proteges. So at this time that things were going really well for Lee, financially, professionally, his company was doing really well. He was done with Givenchy. He was struggling also a lot. He had lots of mental health issues. He had struggled with substance abuse issues as well. And his mentor and friend Izzy was also doing really poorly at the time. Her career was not doing well. She kept getting fired from different places. And, Izzy had dedicated her life to the fashion world, and fashion is all about youth and beauty. And I think she was having a really hard time, and she was just really struggling with it. Around this time, her and her husband had separated. She was having a lot of financial issues, and Lee encouraged her to seek help because she was having major depressive episodes, and so Lee paid for her medical bills. But at the same time, Izzy was doing really terribly. In 2006, I think in the first few months of the year, she attempted to take her own life 3 times. At some point, her and her husband reconciled, but then she was later diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and so the cancer diagnosis sort of triggered another major depressive episode for Izzy. And unfortunately, in 2007, after several attempts to take her own life, she took her own life. This was a really sad time for Lee. Izzy had been a great friend, but she'd been very troubled. They'd had a strained relationship, kind of rocky, but she had been his mentor. She had helped propel his career, so it was pretty rough for him. And he and Philip Tracy, another one of Izzy's proteges, worked together, and they created a fashion show 5 months after her death called La Dame Bleue. And this was a dedication in honor of Izzy and her memory. And at her funeral, Philip Tracy actually placed one of his hats on her casket just to sort of symbolize who she was. In 2009, Lee would make his final appearance at one of his fashion shows. This was for the spring-summer collection, and this was called Plato's Atlantis. This collection was pure fantasy. It was theatrical, it was dramatic. Imagine if humans had to live in a post-world where we all lived underwater, and how would we morph into different aquatic life? How would our anatomy change? The model's hair was made a certain way to change the shape of their skulls, and the iconic armadillo shoes surfaced. The armadillo shoes are so synonymous with McQueen. As I stated earlier, McQueen worked with different musicians. He worked a lot with Lady Gaga as well. A lot of Lady Gaga, a lot of her iconic looks are McQueen. In 2009, Plato's Atlantis was the first fashion show to be streamed online. In 2021, everything is streamed online, but in 2009, this was very new. Lee was always so ahead of the game, and a few minutes before the show was about to start, Lady Gaga tweeted about the show and it crashed the website. Lee had different cameras going back and forth on the runway to sort of capture every single moment, and as the show ended, it premiered the song Bad Romance by Lady Gaga, and if you rewatch the Bad Romance music video, it is full of McQueen fashion. Earlier in 2000, Lee had a marriage ceremony with his partner George Forsyth. It wasn't technically a legal marriage because the ceremony happened in Spain, and at the time, Spain did not recognize same-sex marriage. They separated, but they continued to be friends up until Lee's death. In early 2010, Lee's mother, Joyce, passed away. She was in her mid-70s, still not that old. I think she was 75 or 76, which is a bit young, but this devastated Lee. He was quite close to his mother, and I think things had just been building up for Lee. He had struggled with substance abuse. He had struggled with the stress from work. Like I said, designers are only as good as their last show. And so the pressure kept building and building. And ever since Izzy's mental health problems and suicide, this specter of death kind of loomed over Lee. And unfortunately, in early 2010, on the eve of his mother's funeral, Alexander McQueen committed suicide. This is so sad. I mean, any loss of life is sad, but especially, taking your own life, it's just sad. It's just very tragic and very unfortunate that he wasn't able to get the help that he needed, the counseling. It's just sad. It's just, there's no other words for it. He made arrangements because he had planned this. So he left a large sum of money to his dogs so that they could live in the lap of luxury. And he also left a lot of money to different animal charities across the UK. And he also requested that his ashes be scattered on the Isle of Skye in Scotland. Funeral, one of his friends, Bjork, sang the song Gloomy Sunday in one of his designer gowns. And I'm just left so sad. Like, he was such a visionary. He had such a great artistic vision and talent. And he was like Izzy. He saw beauty where we didn't see it. And as he got older, his collections just kept getting better and better. And I think it's very, very sad that he did not see a way out. And I just think that's very unfortunate. Upon his passing, the Gucci group confirmed that the brand Alexander McQueen would continue, and his long-term assistant, Sarah Burton, became the creative director, and she still is the creative director of Alexander McQueen. Upon his death, one of his siblings, remember he was the youngest of 6, so he had a sister named Janet, and because there were 6 siblings, there were some like larger age gaps. So his sister Janet claimed that Lee had told his family that when he was younger, he had been abused by Janet's abusive ex-husband. Janet's revelations post-funeral, I think, can give context to some of the struggles that Lee had to deal with. I think it's really sad, and it's important to note that Janet divorced this man a very long time ago, and yeah, that's terrible. I don't know what else to say. I won't go into any of the details. I read some articles that have more information. If you want to ruin your day, you can go ahead and do that, but I don't feel comfortable going into details here. And that is the life and legacy of Lee Alexander McQueen. He was so unique, truly one of a kind. He saw beauty where no one else did, and I think that's where he and his friend Izzy really got along. They saw things that no one else could see, and they just had such a wonderful creative vision that we didn't. If you are new here, I talk about a different fashion icon the first Friday of every single month. If you're looking for ways to support me, the best way to support me is to make sure you're subscribed, like the video, and leave a comment. Every time you engage with my channel, that helps stimulate the algorithm. So if you leave a comment and you like the video, YouTube will send more people my way to see the video. So please do that. So I believe this is all I have for Lee Alexander McQueen. Leave a comment, leave a guess, telling me who you think will be next month's subject. I already know who it is, but leave a guess and tell me who you think it is. Thank you all so much for stopping by. I hope you have a beautiful day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.